Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the fall of Constantinople, the siege that ended an empire that had survived for over 1,000 years. Here's something that should make you pause. Constantinople had survived 23 sieges. 23 times, armies had crashed against its walls like waves against a cliff. Arabs, Bulgars, Russians, crusaders, all failed. The city was considered literally unconquerable, protected by walls so massive that people believed God himself had designed them. Then, in the spring of 1453, everything humanity thought they knew about warfare changed in 57 days. An empire that had outlasted Rome itself, that had preserved classical knowledge through the Dark Ages, that had stood as Christianity's eastern shield for 11 centuries, vanished. Not slowly, not through decline, through calculated destruction using weapons that made ancient defences obsolete overnight. Dear viewers, our big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers on this channel, and with your support we can achieve it. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about history. Subscribe so you don't miss them. We're sincerely grateful to everyone who helps us achieve this goal. Also, write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious to see people from all over the world brought together by a single story. And now let's move on to today's story. You're a blacksmith named Theophilus. You're 42 years old in the spring of 1453. You've never seen a printed book. The printing press exists somewhere in Germany, but you'll never hear of it. You've never questioned that Constantinople is the centre of God's creation, the new Rome, the city where heaven touches earth. You know the Theodosian walls protect you the way you know the sun rises. Your father repaired these walls, his father before him. The limestone blocks fit so perfectly that mortar seems decorative rather than necessary. The smell hits you first on April mornings. Not normal city smell. Smoke from countless cooking fires mixed with something sharper. Fierce sweat. The kind that soaks through wool and leather no matter how cold the wind blows. You taste copper on your tongue from the forge, but underneath lurks something else. Dust. Ancient dust from stones that haven't moved in 1,000 years, now vibrating under your feet. Your hands know the weight of the chain links you're repairing on the outer wall. Each link weighs as much as a newborn lamb. The iron is 3 fingers thick. These chains hang across gates to stop battering rams, and they've never broken in battle. Your hammer strikes with rhythms learned from childhood. 3 quick taps, 1 heavy blow, 3 quick taps again. The sound echoes off stone walls 40 feet high, but today the echo comes back wrong. Something absorbs it from across the field. You climb the battlement to look. The sight freezes your hands mid-swing. Tents spread across the landscape like a plague of white mushrooms. They stretch from horizon to horizon, so numerous that counting becomes meaningless. Campfires number in the thousands. The Ottoman army isn't camping nearby. They've brought their entire civilization to your doorstep. Smoke from their fires creates a second horizon, a dark smudge that blocks out the hills you've seen every day of your life. Your fellow defenders whisper numbers. 10,000, 20,000, 50,000. Nobody knows. The Ottomans keep arriving, columns of soldiers marching in from the west, from the north, ship after ship landing on the opposite shore. Each day the camps grow. Each night more fires appear. Constantinople holds 50,000 souls behind its walls. Citizens, soldiers, refugees, all pressed together in a city that once housed 500,000. The population has been bleeding away for decades. Plague, war, poverty. The empire that once stretched from Spain to Syria now consists of this single city and a few islands. Everything else is gone. Conquered, lost, sold to pay mercenaries. Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos commands 7,000 fighting men. That's soldiers, mercenaries, armed citizens and monks who've traded prayer beads for swords. 7,000 against an ocean of enemies. The math is simple. The math is terrifying. You return to your forge beneath the wall. The bellows wheeze as you pump air into coals that glow like dragon eyes. Iron softens to orange, then yellow. You hammer it flat, fold it, hammer again. The sword you're making won't save the city, but idle hands invite madness. Every man works, every woman. Children carry water, stones, arrows. The elderly pray in churches while mixing materials for Greek fire. The secret weapon that burns on water that has broken a dozen sieges before. 3 weeks ago, a Venetian ship captain brought news that made Constantine's face turn grey. No help is coming. The Pope promised crusaders. The Italian city-states promised fleets. The Hungarian king promised cavalry. All lies. Europe is content to watch Constantinople die. They'll wring their hands and compose sad letters, while the Ottomans batter down walls that have protected Christian Europe for centuries. The Genoese sent one man. Giovanni Giustiniani Longo arrived with 700 soldiers and a reputation for defending impossible positions. He's 40 years old, scarred from a dozen sieges, and he surveys the Theodosian walls with eyes that calculate trajectories and breaking points. Constantine made him commander of the land defences within hours. The Greek nobles protested, a foreigner commanding Romans, until Giustiniani walked the walls end to end, pointing out weak spots that locals had ignored for generations. The walls consist of 3 defensive lines. The outer wall stands 40 feet high, with 96 towers spaced along 4 miles of fortification. Behind it, a terrace 40 feet wide allows defenders to mass forces quickly. Then the inner wall rises 60 feet, even more massive, backed by a final terrace. Beyond that, the city itself. These walls have stopped every army that ever faced them, because attackers must breach all 3 lines while defenders rain death from above. But Giustiniani spent 3 days examining the western walls, the land walls, the only approach not protected by sea. He ordered every citizen capable of lifting a stone to begin repairs on sections damaged by earthquakes. He organised work crews, established supply caches, positioned artillery captured from previous Ottoman attacks. The man works 20-hour days and expects everyone else to match his pace. You see him sometimes, walking the battlements at dawn, studying the ground beyond the moat. The Ottomans have been improving that ground, filling in ditches, levelling the approach, building wooden roads to move heavy equipment. Something big is coming, something the walls weren't designed to stop. 2 weeks ago, the sound started. A rhythmic pounding that shakes dust from the ceiling beams of your workshop. Not siege engines. You know that sound from stories. This is deeper. This is stone screaming. The Ottomans are testing their artillery, giant bronze tubes that hurl stone balls weighing as much as 2 men. The balls don't just hit the walls, they punch through. 6 feet of limestone and brick that has stood for 1,000 years develops cracks from a single impact. The first time you saw a cannonball hit, you couldn't process what your eyes reported. The wall didn't crumble, it exploded. Stone fragments flew like arrows. 3 men died instantly, crushed by blocks that weighed hundreds of pounds. The ball itself buried 6 feet into the wall, stuck there like a tooth in rotten wood. Repair crews worked all night filling the crater with rubble and timber, but everyone understood the implication. The weapon that made these walls unbreakable has been invented by the enemy. Greek fire crews position their weapons along the walls. These siphons spray liquid flame that clings to flesh and burns underwater. The formula is a state secret, known only to the families who've manufactured it for centuries. They mix petroleum from distant wells with quicklime, sulphur, and other ingredients they won't name even under torture. The weapons themselves resemble giant brass syringes mounted on swivels. One operator pumps while another aims. The flame shoots 60 feet, turning men into running torches. But Greek fire requires proximity. It works against ships coming alongside walls, against soldiers climbing ladders. It doesn't work against cannon firing from 1,000 yards away. Food supplies cause more immediate worry than weapons. Constantinople's granaries hold enough wheat for 3 months if rationing is strict. The fishing fleet still operates, but Ottoman ships patrol the Bosphorus more aggressively each day. Merchant vessels arrive less frequently. Prices for bread have tripled. Prices for wine have quadrupled. Citizens who once ate meat twice a week now consider themselves fortunate to afford vegetable soup. Constantine ordered all livestock brought inside the walls, cattle low in courtyards where fountains once played. Pigs root through gardens that once grew ornamental flowers. The city smells like a vast barn. But at least there's meat. For now. The emperor appears on the walls daily, walking among common soldiers, memorizing names, asking about families. He wears simple armor, nothing that distinguishes him from professional soldiers. He's 58 years old and has ruled for 4 years, inheriting an empire that existed only on maps. His brothers squabble over pathetic provincial holdings, while he faces annihilation. If he's afraid, his face never shows it. He jokes with men repairing walls. He shares wine from his personal cellar with mercenary captains. He prays in the Hagia Sophia for hours, then emerges to inspect defensive positions with practical military precision. Priests preach that God will never allow his city to fall. Prophecies promise that angels will descend when the enemy reaches the walls. An ancient saying claims that Constantinople will stand until the end of the world. These promises sustain hope, but soldiers on the battlements see reality accumulating across the fields. More tents, more soldiers, more of those terrible bronze cannon being dragged into position by teams of oxen. At night, you climb to the highest tower near your section of wall. The city behind you glows with scattered lamplight. Churches, homes, the great dome of the Hagia Sophia rising like a second moon. 1,100 years of continuous civilization concentrated in 42 square miles. Libraries holding texts that exist nowhere else. Icons painted by saints. The accumulated wealth of an empire that once ruled the Mediterranean. Before you, the Ottoman camps create an artificial dawn. Their fires outnumber the city's lamps 10 to 1, 20 to 1. Mathematics transforms into nightmare when you attempt the calculation. Somewhere in that sea of flames sits Mehmed II, the 21-year-old sultan, who has staked his throne on taking the city his ancestors couldn't conquer. The wind shifts, carrying sounds from the enemy camp, hammering, sawing, the creak of wooden machines being assembled. They're building something, many somethings. Siege towers, probably, though the walls are too high for conventional towers. Catapults, though those seem archaic compared to the cannon. Whatever they're constructing requires thousands of workers labouring through the night. You return to your forge and work until dawn. The sword takes shape under your hammer, the steel folding and refolding until the blade shows patterns like water. You've made weapons for 30 years, but never with this desperate urgency. The blade must be perfect. The edge must hold through a dozen battles. Some young soldier will carry this sword up a ladder or through a breach, and his life will depend on your skill. The walls stand. They've always stood. They were built to last forever, but forever has arrived at the gates with bronze cannon and an enemy who understands that the old rules no longer apply. The stone that saved Constantinople 23 times might crack on the 24th. Technology has advanced beyond fortification. The medieval world is ending, and everyone trapped inside these walls can feel it dying, can taste it in the dust that falls with each cannon shot, can see it in the cracks spreading through limestone that was ancient when their grandfathers were born. Mehmed II became sultan at age 21 with a single thought consuming every waking moment: Constantinople must fall. His father called him reckless. His Grand Vizier warned that previous sultans had broken their armies against those walls. Mehmed executed the Grand Vizier and appointed someone more enthusiastic. The young sultan had already ruled once before at age 12, while his father Murad II retired to pursue spiritual contemplations. That first reign lasted 2 years before crisis forced Murad's return. The experience taught Mehmed that power tolerates no weakness, no hesitation, no failure. When Murad died in 1451, Mehmed returned to the throne carrying grudges and ambitions that terrified his advisors. His first act involved fratricide. Ottoman succession law was brutally simple. The sultan who secured the throne could execute all brothers to prevent civil war. Mehmed had his infant half-brother drowned in a bath. The act wasn't cruelty, it was policy. Cold calculation that valued stability over sentiment. Anyone who flinched at such necessity had no business ruling an empire. Constantinople obsessed him like a fever. Maps covered the walls of his chambers. He studied Roman siege tactics, Byzantine defensive strategies, accounts of every failed Ottoman assault. His tutors had educated him in Greek, Latin, Arabic, Persian, and Hebrew. He read Plutarch and Caesar in their original languages. He understood that conquering the city meant more than military victory. It meant claiming Rome's legacy, positioning the Ottoman Empire as inheritor of classical civilization. But understanding walls and conquering them required different skills entirely. The Theodosian fortifications had been studied by military engineers for centuries. Everyone agreed they were impregnable to conventional assault. Mehmed needed unconventional solutions. He found one in Hungary. A man named Urban appeared at the Byzantine court in 1452, offering to cast cannon for Emperor Constantine. Urban was a founder and engineer, one of the new breed of craftsmen who understood metallurgy, mathematics, and the explosive properties of gunpowder. He claimed he could build weapons capable of destroying any wall in existence. Constantine examined the treasury. Empty. The Byzantine Empire survived on loans from Italian merchants and melted church silver. Urban's price exceeded anything Constantine could pay. The emperor sent him away with apologies and a small purse for his trouble. Urban crossed into Ottoman territory within the week. Mehmed met with him personally. The Sultan listened to proposals for a cannon that would fire stone balls weighing 1,200 pounds. The barrel would stretch 27 feet. The bronze required would cost a fortune. Casting it would take 3 months. Moving it would require 60 oxen and 200 men. Firing it would consume vast quantities of gunpowder. Mehmed asked one question. Would it breach the Theodosian walls? Urban guaranteed it. The Sultan ordered him to begin immediately and provided unlimited funds. By January 1453, the monster cannon was complete. Test firing near Adrianople produced a sound heard 12 miles away. The stone ball travelled over a mile before smashing into the earth and burying itself 6 feet deep. The ground shook like an earthquake. Observers 1,000 yards distant felt heat from the blast. Urban cast additional cannon while the great weapon was transported toward Constantinople. Smaller pieces, though smaller, meant tubes 8 feet long, firing balls weighing 600 pounds. Mehmed assembled the largest siege train ever created. 70 cannon in total, ranging from massive fortress breakers down to anti-personnel weapons that fired fist-sized stones in rapid succession. The Ottoman military machine mobilized with efficiency that shocked foreign observers. Mehmed pulled troops from across the empire: Anatolian cavalry, Rumelian infantry, Christian vassals obligated to provide soldiers, volunteers seeking plunder and paradise. The army swelled beyond 80,000 men. Supply trains stretched for miles. Engineers, miners, carpenters, blacksmiths, entire guilds marched with the army, ready to construct whatever siege equipment the situation required. Mehmed's preparations extended beyond military matters. He needed to isolate Constantinople completely, choking off any possibility of reinforcement or resupply. The Bosphorus Strait separated Europe from Asia, and Byzantine ships still controlled these waters. Ottoman vessels couldn't match Byzantine naval expertise or Greek fire. So Mehmed built a fortress, not near Constantinople, directly across the strait at its narrowest point. Rumeli Hisari rose in 4 months during 1452, constructed with such speed that Byzantine observers couldn't believe the pace. Towers 100 feet tall appeared within weeks. Walls 20 feet thick connected them. Mehmed personally supervised construction, sometimes working alongside labourers, driving the project with manic energy. The fortress wasn't just defensive. Cannon platforms lined the water's edge, positioned to sink any ship attempting passage. When a Venetian merchant vessel ignored warning shots and tried to run the gauntlet, Ottoman gunners sank it with 3 hits. Mehmed had the survivors beheaded and their captain impaled on the shore where passing ships could see the corpse. The Bosphorus was closed, Constantinople's maritime lifeline severed. Byzantine ambassadors arrived at Mehmed's court with protests and appeals. The Sultan received them coldly. They spoke of treaties, of agreements between his father and the empire, of mutual respect and peaceful coexistence. Mehmed listened with the patience of a cat watching mice. When they finished, he announced that treaties died with the men who signed them. His father's promises meant nothing. He was not his father. The ambassadors mentioned that attacking Constantinople would unite Christian Europe against the Ottomans. Mehmed laughed. Europe was divided into squabbling kingdoms more interested in fighting each other than helping distant Byzantium. The Pope might call for a crusade, but crusaders required funding, logistics, political will. By the time European powers stopped arguing about who would pay for what, Constantinople would be Turkish. Constantine sent more embassies. He offered tribute, territorial concessions, trade advantages. Mehmed refused everything. He wanted the city, not compromises. His demands escalated with each negotiation. Surrender the city and live, resist and die. No middle ground existed. No face-saving retreat was possible. Mehmed had staked his reputation, his throne, his place in history on this siege. Failure meant deposition or assassination by disappointed nobles. Success meant glory eternal. We hope you've already subscribed to our channel, and if not, please do so right now. Our goal is to reach our first 1,000 subscribers. This is very important to us. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about history. Subscribe so you don't miss them, and we'll get back to the story. Mehmed assembled his war council in February 1453. Generals who had fought for decades, engineers who had built fortresses from Egypt to Hungary, naval commanders who controlled the Black Sea and Eastern Mediterranean. He laid out the plan with precision that betrayed months of preparation. The army would march in early April, arriving before the spring planting season, when defenders might receive grain from surrounding territories. The fleet would blockade the city from the sea, while land forces invested the walls. Cannon would batter selected points until breaches appeared. Then massed infantry assaults would exploit the gaps. One general, an old warrior named Halil Pasha, urged caution. 23 previous sieges had failed. The walls were legendary. A failed siege would embolden enemies throughout the empire and invite rebellion. Perhaps negotiation offered better outcomes than assault. Mehmed listened without expression. After Halil finished speaking, the Sultan thanked him for his counsel and dismissed the council. Halil Pasha was removed from his position the following day. Rumours suggested poison, though he lived. The message was clear: doubt equaled disloyalty, and Mehmed tolerated neither. Officers who expressed concerns found themselves reassigned to distant provinces. The army would attack because the Sultan commanded it, and the Sultan's word was absolute. Financial preparation matched military logistics. Mehmed emptied the treasury to fund the campaign. Gold flowed to weapon makers, armour smiths, shipyards. The Ottoman economy shifted to war footing. Taxes increased. Provincial governors received orders to provide soldiers, supplies, or money, preferably all three. The empire strained under the burden, but Mehmed calculated that victory would repay every expense tenfold. Constantinople's wealth, accumulated over centuries, would fill Ottoman coffers. The city's strategic position controlling trade routes between Europe and Asia would generate perpetual revenue. Religious scholars provided theological justification. Constantinople represented the last major Christian stronghold blocking Muslim expansion into Europe. Capturing it fulfilled prophecies, demonstrated God's favour, validated Ottoman claims to universal empire. Mehmed styled himself as Ghazi, a holy warrior, though his private beliefs likely ran more toward classical philosophy than religious enthusiasm. But soldiers fought better when convinced that paradise awaited those who died in battle. By March, the army began its march. Cavalry units departed first, securing roads and gathering intelligence. Infantry followed in organised formations that took 3 days to pass any single point. The artillery train moved last, those massive cannon requiring constant maintenance on roads that degraded under their weight. Engineers preceded them, reinforcing bridges, widening paths, sometimes rerouting entire sections to accommodate the largest pieces. Urban's great cannon presented unique challenges. The tube alone weighed 19 tons. With its wooden carriage, the total reached closer to 30. 60 oxen pulled it, with hundreds of men supporting the effort with levers and ropes. The procession moved 3 miles per day at best. Mehmed assigned an entire regiment to guard it, understanding that this weapon could determine the siege's outcome. If it reached Constantinople intact and functioned as promised, no wall could stand against it. Scouts reported the army's approach to Constantine weeks before arrival. The emperor watched the reports accumulate with growing despair. Numbers far exceeded even pessimistic estimates. The cannon train alone suggested that Mehmed wasn't planning a conventional siege but something fundamentally different, an assault that would rewrite military doctrine. Constantine called a council of war. Giustiniani assessed their chances with brutal honesty. The walls would hold against conventional assault but might crack under sustained artillery bombardment. Everything depended on whether defenders could repair breaches faster than cannon created them. Manpower shortages meant thin coverage along 4 miles of fortification. The Ottomans could concentrate overwhelming force against selected points, while defenders struggled to shift reserves quickly enough. Naval officers reported worse news. The Ottoman fleet, while inferior to the Byzantine navy ship for ship, possessed overwhelming numerical superiority. 50 warships blocked the Sea of Marmara. More vessels patrolled the Bosphorus. The Golden Horn remained protected by a massive chain stretched across its entrance. No ship could enter that harbour without Byzantine permission, but the rest of the sea lanes were lost. Diplomatic efforts produced nothing. A final embassy to Mehmed returned with the Sultan's answer delivered verbally since he refused to commit ultimatums to writing. Surrender the city and live in peace. Resist and every soul inside the walls would be killed or enslaved. Mehmed would allow 3 days of plunder for his soldiers, as Islamic law permitted. After 3 days, Constantinople would be rebuilt as the Ottoman capital, populated by loyal subjects brought from across the empire. Constantine rejected the ultimatum. He would die defending the city rather than surrender what 100 generations had preserved. The choice between slavery and death presented no real choice for a Byzantine emperor. Honor demanded resistance. Faith demanded trust in God's protection. Pride demanded that Rome's heir not meekly submit to barbarians, regardless of their numbers or weapons. The stage was set. A 21-year-old sultan who would accept nothing less than total victory marched against a city that had never fallen, defended by a 58-year-old emperor who had nowhere to retreat. Both men understood that this siege would end only with complete triumph or absolute destruction. No compromise existed. No negotiated settlement remained possible. One civilization would survive. The other would vanish from history. The Ottoman army arrived like a nation migrating to new lands. Tents appeared across the landscape in organized rows that stretched beyond sight. Each unit claimed designated ground according to plans drawn months earlier. Anatolian troops on the southern flank, European vassals to the north, elite janissaries held in reserve near Mehmed's red and gold command pavilion. The encampment functioned as a mobile city housing 80,000 men plus support personnel, animals, equipment. Constantine watched from the walls as the camps expanded hourly. New columns arrived throughout April 6th and 7th, each adding to the force already encircling the city. Dust clouds marked approaching units miles before they materialized. The sound of marching feet created a continuous rumble like distant thunder that never ended. This wasn't an army. It was a migration, an invasion, the physical manifestation of empire. April 8th brought the artillery. Urban's monster cannon appeared on the horizon, pulled by its team of oxen, moving at the pace of a slow walk. Even from 2 miles away, defenders could identify the weapon by its size. Nothing that large had ever been built for war. The bronze tube caught sunlight, gleaming like a fallen column from some ancient temple. Engineers had constructed a specialized road for its journey, and even that path showed damage from the weight. Smaller cannon followed, dozens of them, each requiring teams of oxen and crews of specialists. Ottoman engineers began positioning them at carefully measured distances from the walls. They drove stakes, took sightings with surveying instruments, calculated angles that would make their shots most effective. Mathematics governed modern warfare in ways that pure courage couldn't overcome. The great cannon took 5 days to position. Its platform required foundations dug deep into bedrock. Timber supports had to be precisely calibrated to absorb recoil that would otherwise shatter the weapon. Urban supervised personally, checking measurements repeatedly, rejecting beams that showed the slightest imperfection. A single miscalculation would destroy 3 months of work and kill everyone nearby when the barrel exploded. Defenders watched these preparations with growing dread. The weapon pointed at the Lycus Valley sector, where the land sloped gently toward the walls, and ancient river erosion had weakened foundations. Giustiniani recognized the choice as militarily sound. If any section might crack under bombardment, the Lycus Valley represented the best bet. He ordered double crews assigned to that area, stockpiled repair materials, positioned his best troops where they'd be needed most. April 11th arrived with clear skies and light wind. Perfect conditions for the first shot. Urban loaded the great cannon with a stone ball that required 16 men to lift into place. The sphere had been carved from granite and polished smooth to reduce air resistance. It weighed 1,200 pounds, more than some of the smaller cannon weighed complete. Gunpowder filled the chamber in measured quantities, packed carefully to ensure even burning. Too much would rupture the barrel, too little would waste the shot. Urban had performed calculations that factored in barrel length, projectile weight, desired range, and the peculiar properties of the specific gunpowder mixture he'd developed. Everything reduced to numbers, trajectories, physics. The crew retreated to safety positions. Urban applied the match himself, touching flame to the touch hole. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the earth convulsed. The sound defied description. Thunder multiplied by 100 couldn't match it. The blast wave knocked men off the walls half a mile away. Windows throughout Constantinople shattered simultaneously. Birds fell dead from the sky, killed by the pressure alone. The cannon itself vanished in a cloud of smoke and fire that rose 200 feet into the air. When the smoke cleared, the gun crew cautiously approached. The barrel had survived, though it glowed red from the heat. Where the shot landed, the wall showed a crater 6 feet deep. Stone blocks weighing hundreds of pounds had been pulverized to dust. The impact point radiated cracks in all directions, creating a spiderweb pattern across 40 feet of fortification. Defenders stared at the damage in silence. One shot had accomplished what battering rams couldn't achieve in weeks. The stone that had protected Constantinople for a millennium suddenly seemed fragile as pottery. But Ottoman gunners discovered problems immediately. The great cannon required 3 hours to cool sufficiently for the next shot. Rushing the process risked warping the barrel or causing catastrophic failure. The weapon could fire 7 times daily at most, and each firing required complete recalibration due to recoil that shifted the entire platform despite its massive foundation. Urban's smaller cannon compensated for this limitation. They fired more rapidly, maintained accuracy better, required less maintenance. By April 12th, 14 Ottoman guns were hammering the walls in coordinated bombardment. Stone dust created perpetual clouds that choked defenders and coated everything in grey powder. The taste invaded food, water, lungs. Men coughed constantly, their sputum black with stone particles. Each cannon shot created its own drama. Defenders learned to recognize the flashboom sequence that signaled incoming fire. A bright flare from Ottoman positions, then counting heartbeats until the ball arrived. You couldn't see the projectile in flight. It moved too fast, but you heard the whistle as it cut through air. The impact produced another explosion of sound and flying debris. Some shots missed high, sailing over the walls to smash into buildings beyond. Houses collapsed when 1,200-pound balls struck them. One shot killed 17 people sheltering in a church when the roof caved in. Another demolished a market, scattering vegetables and vendor carts across 3 streets. The city learned to fear every discharge, never knowing where destruction would fall next. Other shots struck true, gouging chunks from fortifications that had stood since the 5th century. The Theodosian walls showed wounds that bled stone and mortar. Each sunset revealed new damage. Each dawn brought worse news as engineers assessed structural integrity. Cracks propagated through limestone in unpredictable patterns. A wall that looked solid might collapse hours later when hidden fractures reached critical mass. Repair crews worked through darkness, racing against the next bombardment. They hauled rubble to fill craters, packed spaces with earth and broken stone, braced weakened sections with timber. Women and children joined the effort, forming human chains to pass materials. Monks abandoned prayers to lift beams. Merchants who'd never performed physical labour bloodied their hands moving rocks. Giustiniani organised the work with military precision. He divided the walls into sectors, assigned commanders to each section, established supply dumps at regular intervals. Crews rotated shifts so men could rest without leaving positions undefended. The Genoese commander seemed to exist in 3 places simultaneously, inspecting repairs at the Lycus Valley, checking supplies near the Golden Gate, consulting with Constantine about reserve deployments. The bombardment established a rhythm that dominated life. Dawn brought the first shots as Ottoman gunners took advantage of clear morning light. They'd fire steadily until noon, then break for the afternoon heat when gunpowder burned unpredictably and metal expanded in dangerous ways. Evening brought another barrage that continued until darkness made aiming impossible. Nighttime meant frantic repairs under torchlight. Mehmed watched his guns destroy Constantinople's invincibility with satisfaction that bordered on religious ecstasy. Each successful hit validated his investment, his strategy, his vision of modern warfare. He'd gambled the Empire's treasury on Urban's promises, and those promises were being fulfilled in spectacular fashion. The weapon that made Constantinople impregnable had been rendered obsolete by bronze and gunpowder, but the Sultan recognized that destroying walls didn't equal conquest. Breaches had to be exploited with infantry assaults that would cost thousands of lives. His soldiers needed motivation beyond plunder. They needed to believe victory was inevitable, that the city's fall was merely a matter of time. Mehmed ordered raids to probe Byzantine defences, test response times, identify weak points. Ottoman troops attacked on April 18th with scaling ladders and grappling hooks, targeting a section near the Blakane Palace, where walls seemed less formidable. Defenders met them with arrows, crossbow bolts, stones, boiling oil. Greek fire operators incinerated climbing soldiers, turning men into screaming torches that fell into the moat. The assault lasted 4 hours before Mehmed recalled his troops. Casualties exceeded 500. The attack taught both sides valuable lessons. Ottomans learned that Byzantine defenders, though outnumbered, fought with desperate efficiency. Every soldier knew that retreat was impossible. Surrender meant slavery, defeat meant death. Such men sold their lives expensively. Byzantines learned that Ottoman forces possessed discipline and courage that conventional wisdom hadn't credited. These weren't barbarian hordes, but professional soldiers who followed orders and pressed attacks despite horrific losses. Artillery continued its methodical destruction. By April 20th, sections of the outer wall had collapsed entirely near the Lycus Valley. Rubble filled the moat in places, creating rough causeways that infantry might cross. Giustiniani supervised construction of a secondary defensive line behind the breach, using broken stones and earth to create improvised fortifications. If attackers breached the outer wall, they'd face another barrier immediately behind it. Meanwhile, the great cannon developed problems. The intense heat from daily firing had created microfractures in the barrel. Urban ordered reduced charges and longer cooling periods, but the weapon was slowly destroying itself from within. Each shot widened existing cracks imperceptibly. The bronze would fail eventually. The only question was when and whether it would kill the crew in the process. Smaller guns picked up the slack. Ottoman artillery tactics evolved rapidly, as commanders learned which weapons worked best against which targets. Heavy cannon attacked walls directly, while medium guns targeted towers and battlements. Light pieces fired against defensive positions, suppressing Byzantine counter-battery fire and killing men on exposed ramparts. Constantine moved among his troops constantly, his presence worth more than additional soldiers. He shared rations with common defenders, helped carry stones during repairs, stood in exposed positions where Ottoman sharpshooters might target him. His officers begged him to show caution, but the emperor understood that visible courage inspired courage in others. A leader who hid while subjects died would lose their loyalty faster than Ottoman cannon destroyed walls. Food supplies deteriorated faster than expected. The fishing fleet reported Ottoman patrols blocking access to good waters. Catches declined. Prices increased. Rationing grew stricter. Citizens who'd eaten twice daily reduced to single meals. The wealthy discovered that gold couldn't buy food that didn't exist. Merchants hoarded supplies, hoping to sell at maximum prices later, until Constantine authorized house-to-house searches and executed profiteers in public squares. April's end approached with the siege having achieved equilibrium. Ottoman cannon destroyed sections of wall. Byzantine repair crews rebuilt them each night. Probing attacks tested defences without committing to full assault. Both sides settled into patterns that suggested weeks or months of grinding attrition ahead. Neither commander wanted prolonged siege, but neither saw clear paths to quick victory. The walls held, battered, but standing. The Ottomans suffered casualties but possessed inexhaustible manpower. Mathematics suggested stalemate. Reality promised something different. Constantinople's harbour, the Golden Horn, represented the city's most secure defence. A massive chain stretched across the harbour mouth from the city walls to the Genoese colony of Galata on the opposite shore. Each link weighed as much as a grown man. The iron had been forged in segments over decades, maintained constantly, tested under every imaginable stress. Ships attempting to ram it would destroy themselves against metal that could support the weight of buildings. Byzantine naval commanders considered the Golden Horn impregnable. The chain made forced entry impossible. Ottoman vessels crowded the Bosphorus and Sea of Marmara, but they couldn't access the protected harbour where Byzantine warships sheltered, along with merchant vessels, fishing boats, and grain ships that represented the city's maritime lifeline. Control of the Golden Horn meant Constantinople maintained naval superiority in the one area where walls didn't matter. Mehmed studied the problem with increasing frustration throughout late April. His admirals reported that breaking the chain required ships they didn't possess. Ramming would accomplish nothing. Cutting it under water was impossible given its weight and the depth. Greek fire made any sustained assault suicidal. Byzantine crews could incinerate Ottoman vessels faster than replacements arrived. The harbour represented a strategic deadlock that favoured defenders absolutely. The Sultan consulted engineers, naval architects, mathematicians. Could the chain be destroyed with cannon fire? Shots would skip off the water's surface or sink without effect. Could divers attach explosives? Divers would be spotted and killed, and gunpowder didn't detonate reliably underwater anyway. Could specialised ships break through? No such vessels existed, and building them would require months that Mehmed didn't have. Then someone suggested the impossible. If ships couldn't break through the chain, perhaps they could bypass it entirely. The Golden Horn was protected by geography. Steep hills separated it from the Bosphorus Valley to the northeast. Ships sailed through water, not over land. Everyone knew this. Everyone accepted it as fundamental reality. Mehmed asked a different question. How fundamental was that reality? Roman armies had transported ships overland during sieges. Byzantine forces had done the same centuries ago. The technique was ancient, proven, but never attempted at this scale. Moving one or two small boats across flat ground presented manageable challenges. Hauling 70 warships over hills seemed insane. The Sultan ordered engineers to survey the terrain immediately. They returned with measurements, slope calculations, and unanimous pessimism. The route from the Bosphorus to the Golden Horn covered approximately 1 mile but included 2 ridges and a valley. The incline reached 30 degrees in places. Trees, rocks, and gullies complicated every yard. Moving ships that distance would require road construction, lubrication systems, and thousands of labourers working in coordination. The timeline suggested weeks of effort. Mehmed gave them 3 days. Engineers protested that physical reality couldn't be negotiated. The Sultan responded that reality adjusted to Ottoman will, not the reverse. Work began April 22nd with forced labour from every available source. Soldiers not assigned to siege duties became road builders. Christian vassals provided conscript workers. Local peasants were rounded up and given shovels. The labour force swelled beyond 10,000 men attacking a single engineering problem. They cut trees and laid them perpendicular to the route, creating a rolling road of logs. Oxen fat, sheep tallow and olive oil were collected in massive quantities and spread across the wooden surface until it gleamed. Engineers designed cradles that would hold ships upright while sliding over the greased logs. Teams of oxen and men would provide pulling power, with hundreds more pushing from behind and stabilizing with ropes from the sides. The work proceeded with manic intensity that only absolute authority could generate. Men collapsed from exhaustion and were replaced instantly. Trees fell by the hundreds. The smell of animal fat rendered Constantinople's northern districts nauseating. Ottoman supervisors drove labourers brutally, understanding that Mehmed's displeasure was more dangerous than any amount of physical suffering. Byzantine scouts reported this activity but couldn't determine its purpose. Giustiniani observed through a spyglass, watching frantic construction in the hills northeast of the city. The scale suggested something significant, but trees blocked clear views. He dispatched a night raid to investigate. 20 men slipped out through a postern gate, circled through Ottoman lines, and approached the construction site before sentries spotted them. A brief, vicious skirmish erupted. 15 Byzantines died, but 5 returned with impossible information. The Ottomans were building a road for ships that would somehow sail over hills and descend into the Golden Horn behind the defensive chain. Giustiniani presented this intelligence to Constantine with visible skepticism. The emperor consulted his own engineers, who declared the scheme theoretically possible but practically insane. The effort required, the coordination necessary, the risk of failure. No rational commander would attempt it. Mehmed was attempting it. On April 29th, the first ship began its journey. The vessel was a fusta, a light galley designed for speed rather than cargo. It rested in its wooden cradle on the greased log road like an absurd monument to hubris. 70 oxen were hitched to the cradle in teams. 300 men took positions along ropes attached to the cradle's sides. Another 100 prepared to replace logs from the rear as the front rollers passed over them. The command to pull echoed across the hillside. Oxen strained against their harnesses. Men heaved on ropes with synchronized rhythm, shouted by overseers. The cradle didn't move. More force was applied. Whips cracked. Men threw their entire weight against resistance that seemed immovable. Then, with a groan that sounded almost alive, the cradle shifted. Inches at first, then feet. The ship was moving overland. The pace resembled a funeral march. Each yard required concentrated effort from hundreds of workers. Logs had to be continuously recycled from back to front. The cradle required constant adjustment to prevent tipping. Oxen were rotated regularly as teams exhausted themselves. But the ship moved. Uphill, impossibly, against every law of reasonable effort, the vessel climbed. Defenders on Constantinople's walls watched in horrified fascination as the first galley crested the ridge and disappeared down the other side. They'd witnessed something that shouldn't exist. Naval warfare unbound from water, ships sailing through forest like vessels through waves. The implications were catastrophic. If one ship could make the journey, others would follow. The Golden Horn's security rested on that chain, and the chain was being circumvented by sheer determination and engineering audacity. The first ship reached the Golden Horn on April 30th and splashed into water that had seemed eternally safe. Ottoman sailors cheered. Mehmed rowed to the shoreline personally, watched the vessel settle, and ordered the next ship prepared immediately. 70 ships needed transport. Even with roads established and techniques refined, moving the fleet would take days. But time had shifted in the Ottomans' favour. Each ship that completed the journey reduced Byzantine naval advantage incrementally. Byzantine commanders held emergency council. The chain still protected the main harbour entrance, but Ottoman vessels now operated inside the Golden Horn's supposedly secure waters. Supply ships could be attacked, fishing boats would be hunted. The Byzantine fleet would have to fight on two fronts simultaneously, against the enemy outside the chain and the enemy behind it. Naval superiority had evaporated in less than a week through a strategy no one anticipated, because no one believed it possible. Admiral Luca Notaras proposed a night attack to destroy the Ottoman ships while they remained few. His galleys could strike after dark, use Greek fire to incinerate enemy vessels, and withdraw before reinforcements arrived. The plan was sound, aggressive, exactly what military doctrine demanded. Constantine approved the operation for the night of May 3rd, but Genoese merchants in Galata complicated everything. These Italian traders maintained theoretical neutrality, providing supplies to both sides while protecting their profitable position. They'd permitted the chain's landward end to be secured on their territory, but had no desire to see full combat erupt in waters where their own ships operated. When Ottoman ships began appearing in the Golden Horn, Genoese authorities sent urgent messages to Constantinople. Any Byzantine attack launched from the Golden Horn against Ottoman vessels would be considered a violation of Galata's neutrality and would result in Genoese fortifications firing on Byzantine ships. The threat was credible. Galata's walls mounted cannon and catapults capable of destroying Byzantine galleys. The Tower of Galata rose high enough to provide perfect firing angles down onto any vessels near the chain. Venetian merchants in Constantinople urged ignoring the Genoese. Venice and Genoa were traditional rivals, and Venetians saw opportunity in Genoese discomfort. But Constantine couldn't afford to fight Genoese and Ottomans simultaneously. The night raid was cancelled. Ottoman ships continued their overland journey unmolested. By May 5th, 30 vessels operated in the Golden Horn. By May 8th, the number reached 50. Each arrival brought Turkish forces closer to Constantinople's sea walls on the harbour side. Walls that were thinner and less defended than the massive Theodosian fortifications facing landward. Mehmed exploited his new advantage immediately. He ordered construction of a pontoon bridge across the Golden Horn's narrowest section, connecting his camps on both shores. Boats were lashed together, timber laid across them, the whole structure secured with chains and anchors. Within 3 days, Ottoman soldiers could march directly from one side of the siege lines to the other without lengthy detours. Troop movements that previously took hours now required minutes. Byzantine defenders watched their strategic position deteriorate with sickening speed. The city that had survived 23 sieges by controlling its waters now found enemy ships sailing where none should exist. The harbour that had seemed eternally secure was compromised. Supply lines were threatened. The fishing fleet couldn't operate. Reserves had to be diverted to defend seawalls that were never designed to resist serious assault. Giustiniani recalculated force distributions with grim mathematics. 4 miles of land walls required constant manning. Now harbour walls needed significant defence too. 7,000 fighting men stretched even thinner across more defensive positions. Ottoman forces concentrated wherever they chose, while Byzantine defenders scattered across too much perimeter. The numbers were working against Constantine with increasing severity. Food became critical faster than expected. Fishing had supplemented stored grain, allowing rationing to remain bearable. Without fishing, reserves depleted at alarming rates. Bread portions shrank. Meat disappeared entirely except for officers. Citizens began showing signs of malnutrition, hollow faces, listless movements. The peculiar translucent quality skin develops when bodies consume themselves for energy. Constantine authorized hunting the cattle and pigs inside the walls. Livestock that represented future food security was slaughtered for immediate need. The decision brought weeks but at terrible cost. Each animal killed was one that couldn't breed, couldn't produce milk, couldn't be saved for later emergency. The city was eating its future. Morale suffered more than walls did. Artillery damage could be repaired, breaches could be filled, but the psychological impact of Ottoman ships appearing behind supposedly impregnable defences broke something in civilian consciousness. The walls had always protected them. The harbour had always been safe. These axioms of Byzantine existence suddenly seemed fragile. If walls could be breached by new weapons and harbours bypassed by impossible engineering, what other certainties might crumble? Priests preached sermons about faith tested by adversity. God allowed suffering to strengthen believers, they claimed. Constantinople would be saved by miracle when human effort failed. This had always been prophesied. But congregations noticed that these same priests looked terrified, that their voices trembled when describing divine deliverance, that they kept glancing toward the walls as if expecting Ottoman banners to appear any moment. Mehmed celebrated his engineering triumph by parading through his camps on a white stallion, accepting cheers from soldiers who'd witnessed impossible things made real. The young sultan had proven that determination and innovation could overcome any obstacle. Walls meant nothing against proper artillery. Chains meant nothing against creative thinking. The Byzantines defended a medieval fortress with medieval tactics. He was waging modern warfare with tools that made ancient defences obsolete. The siege's character transformed completely in those 8 days. What had been a conventional grinding assault became something fluid and unpredictable. Mehmed had demonstrated willingness to attempt strategies that seemed insane until they succeeded. Byzantine commanders couldn't anticipate his next move because he operated outside traditional military logic. The young sultan was rewriting siege warfare's rules, while Constantine struggled to defend using outdated playbooks. Innovation had become a weapon more devastating than any cannon, and the Ottomans wielded it with ruthless creativity. Strange omens began appearing in early May, signs that terrified even skeptics who dismissed superstition. On May 3rd, a full moon rose over Constantinople as expected, but then darkness crept across its face. A lunar eclipse, rare but explainable through astronomy. Yet Byzantine prophecy had long promised that the city would never fall under a full moon. Citizens watched that moon disappear into shadow and understood the prophecy's cruel precision. Technically full, technically still visible, but fundamentally wrong. The heavens themselves seemed to be exploiting loopholes. Priests offered reassurances that rang hollow. The moon returned after 3 hours, they noted, just as Constantinople would emerge from this darkness. But soldiers on the walls muttered about cosmic betrayals. They'd believed in divine protection the way they believed in sunrise. That belief was cracking. May 5th brought worse. A religious procession carrying the city's most sacred icon, an image of the Virgin Mary said to be painted by St. Luke himself, wound through streets seeking God's intervention. Thousands participated, chanting prayers that echoed off stone buildings. The icon rested on a platform carried by 12 priests in shifts. The thing weighed hundreds of pounds with its gold and jewelled frame. Then the platform tilted. Witnesses disagree on details. Some claim a priest stumbled. Others insist the icon moved by itself, trying to flee the doomed city. The platform crashed to the cobblestones. The icon broke free and tumbled into the street. Its weight should have required 4 men to lift. 12 men struggled to raise it. They heaved and strained while the crowd watched in horrified silence. The Virgin Mary, Constantinople's patron and protector, had become impossibly heavy, as if refusing to return to her church. They eventually managed to lift it, but the procession ended immediately. Rain began falling despite clear skies moments before. Not normal rain, torrential sheets that flooded streets within minutes. The procession dissolved into chaos as people sought shelter from weather that violated natural law. Water rose to ankle depth, then knee depth. Houses flooded. The icon was rushed back to Hagia Sophia through currents that swept away anything loose. The rain stopped as suddenly as it started. Streets drained, revealing drowned rats and debris. But fog rolled in behind the storm, dense white clouds that reduced visibility to arm's length. Constantinople vanished into whiteness so complete that defenders on the walls couldn't see Ottoman camps 200 yards distant. The fog persisted for 3 days. During that time, red lights appeared in the mist, diffuse glows that moved with no apparent source. Some claimed they were lanterns from Ottoman patrols. Others knew no natural flame glowed that particular crimson shade. Mehmed's troops saw the lights too and refused to approach them. Janissaries who'd fought in a dozen campaigns claimed the red glows were jinn, supernatural beings drawn to battlefields where many would soon die. Ottoman priests performed rituals to ward off evil influences. The Sultan ordered the lights investigated. Soldiers sent into the fog returned hours later, pale and unwilling to describe what they had encountered. Mehmed executed 2 men for cowardice before others would speak. They'd found nothing, no lanterns, no fires, no explanation. Just red light that receded when approached and intensified when they turned away. The fog lifted on May 8th to reveal that nothing physical had changed. Walls still stood. Ottoman camps remained in position. But something intangible had shifted. Defenders felt it like pressure in their chests. This sense that cosmic forces had weighed Constantinople and found it wanting. Even Constantine, who'd maintained stoic confidence throughout the siege, looked gaunt and haunted. Financial desperation matched spiritual crisis. The imperial treasury was empty, literally empty. The rooms held nothing but dust and memories. Constantine had melted every gold and silver object in the palace. Crowns, plates, ceremonial weapons, decorative fixtures, all reduced to coins that were now spent. He authorized churches to surrender their treasures for the common defense. Priests complied with varying reluctance, understanding that preserving gold while the city fell was pointless, yet feeling each surrendered chalice and icon cover as a personal amputation. The melted church silver paid mercenaries through mid-May. After that, promises would have to suffice. Genoese soldiers under Giustiniani were professionals who expected regular compensation. Venetian sailors demanded payment for every ship that sailed, every cargo that risked Ottoman capture. Turkish mercenaries who'd defected to Byzantine service for better pay started eyeing the walls from the inside, calculating whether switching sides again might prove profitable. Constantine addressed his commanders on May 12th with brutal honesty. No reinforcements were coming. European powers had abandoned them. The Pope's promises were lies. Venetian senators had debated sending a relief fleet for 3 months, and would debate 3 months more while Constantinople bled. The city stood alone against an enemy that grew stronger daily. Every man present could surrender, could flee on the ships that still occasionally broke through Ottoman patrols. No one would blame them. No one left. Giustiniani reaffirmed his commitment publicly. The Genoese mercenary had no obligation beyond his contract, which promised payment in amounts that no longer existed. Yet he stayed, organising defences with undiminished energy, personally leading sorties that killed hundreds of Ottoman soldiers. His reasons remained opaque. Perhaps honour, perhaps recognition that his reputation depended on impossible victories, perhaps simple warrior's pride that refused to admit defeat. The walls showed structural damage that repair crews couldn't fully address. Artillery had created multiple breaches in the outer fortifications near the Lycus Valley. Defenders had filled gaps with rubble and earth, but these improvised patches lacked the strength of original construction. A determined assault might crack through where stone had held for centuries. Giustiniani positioned his best troops there, understanding that when the final attack came, it would strike at obvious weakness. Urban's great cannon finally failed on May 14th. The barrel split along existing microfractures during an afternoon bombardment. The explosion killed Urban and 16 crew members instantly. Metal fragments scythed through nearby Ottoman positions, wounding dozens more. The weapon that had symbolised Mehmed's technological superiority was reduced to smoking bronze wreckage, but smaller cannon continued firing. The siege train included 70 pieces total, and loss of the largest merely shifted burden to medium guns that actually fired more reliably. Ottoman artillery doctrine adapted quickly. Engineers calculated that sustained bombardment from multiple weapons did more damage than occasional monster shots. A dozen guns firing hourly created more breaches than one gun firing 7 times daily. Byzantine countermeasures grew increasingly desperate. Defenders suspended heavy leather hides stuffed with wool over vulnerable wall sections, hoping the padding would absorb cannonball impacts. It didn't work. Projectiles punched through the barriers and shattered stone behind. They tried hanging chains to deflect shots. The chains snapped or became embedded in walls when struck. They packed earth behind weak sections, creating slopes that would theoretically disperse impact force. Cannon fire simply excavated the earth along with the stone. Food rationing reached crisis levels. Daily bread portions shrank to amounts that left men weak and dizzy. Meat was a memory. Fish was forbidden luxury. Citizens boiled leather to extract minimal nutrition. Horses and mules that pulled carts were slaughtered and distributed according to complicated formulas that tried to balance fairness with strategic necessity. The wealthy still ate better than commoners, but even aristocrats knew genuine hunger for the first time in their lives. Disease began appearing predictably. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Crowded conditions spread illness rapidly. Dysentery swept through districts near the walls, killing dozens daily. The bodies were buried at night in mass graves dug behind churches. Constantine ordered that civilian casualties not be announced publicly. Morale couldn't withstand the knowledge that disease was killing more people than Ottoman weapons. Mehmed launched probing assaults throughout mid-May, testing different sections of wall, measuring response times, identifying which defenders seemed most exhausted. None of these attacks committed significant forces. Casualties ran to hundreds rather than thousands. But each assault forced Byzantine commanders to guess where the real assault would eventually fall, to shift limited reserves, to respond to threats that materialized and vanished like the red lights in the fog. Ottoman miners began tunneling operations on May 16th. Engineers identified sections where walls rested on bedrock versus sections built over filled ground. The latter were vulnerable to undermining. Dig beneath the foundations, shore the tunnel with timber, pack it with explosives, then detonate to collapse wall sections. Byzantine defenders could hear the digging, a rhythmic scraping that came from underground like giant insects burrowing. Giustiniani organised countermining operations. Byzantine crews dug their own tunnels, intersecting Ottoman passages, fighting brief, vicious battles in darkness where men killed each other with daggers and clubs in spaces too confined for swords. These subterranean wars produced no glory, no witnesses, just corpses buried in collapsed tunnels. Miners on both sides developed superstitions about underground spirits, about the earth itself rejecting their violation. A Byzantine countermine successfully intercepted an Ottoman tunnel on May 20th. The defenders packed it with barrels of gunpowder and ignited the charge. The explosion killed 30 Ottoman miners and collapsed 50 feet of tunnel, but it also destabilized Byzantine fortifications above. A tower cracked from foundation to battlements and required immediate abandonment. Giustiniani ordered no more underground explosions near walls. Better to fight enemy miners hand to hand than risk destroying your own defences. Constantinople's remaining grain supplies would last another month at current rationing levels. After that, starvation. The fishing fleet had been reduced to 3 vessels that sailed only at night, risking Ottoman patrols for catches that barely fed a single district. Merchant ships no longer attempted to reach the city. The profit potential couldn't justify the risk. The blockade was absolute, strangling, precisely calibrated to let defenders watch their supplies diminish, while maintaining futile hope that relief might arrive before the end. Constantine spent increasing time in the Hagia Sophia, praying before altars where gold and silver had been stripped away for the war effort. The great church looked naked, violated, its famous treasures reduced to bare stone. The emperor's prayers grew longer and more intense. Observers noted that he no longer prayed for victory but for strength to face what was coming. The distinction was significant. Constantine had accepted that Constantinople would fall. He was preparing to die well rather than escape. Giustiniani made opposite preparations. The mercenary commander stockpiled weapons at key defensive positions, positioned ammunition where it would be needed, identified secondary and tertiary defensive lines for fighting withdrawal. He was planning to survive, to hold as long as possible, to extract maximum blood price for every yard surrendered. His professional reputation demanded nothing less. The city would fall, but the defence would be remembered as magnificent disaster rather than easy conquest. May 25th brought news that destroyed final hopes. A Venetian brigantine broke through Ottoman patrols with dispatches from Italy. The Pope would not call a crusade. Venice would not send its fleet. Hungarian forces were committed elsewhere. The European powers expressed sympathy and promised to remember Constantinople in their prayers. That was all. Words without substance. Sympathy without ships or soldiers or supplies. Constantine read the dispatches privately, then burned them. He assembled his commanders and told them that no help was coming, that they'd suspected as much, that nothing changed except now they knew for certain. The defence would continue because surrender meant enslavement or death regardless. Better to die fighting than live in chains. Better to force Mehmed to pay in blood for every stone than meekly hand over the keys to a city that had stood for 11 centuries. The meeting ended with grim determination rather than despair. These men had chosen their fate weeks ago. Confirmation merely removed uncertainty. They would fight the final battle whenever it came, would sell their lives at exorbitant prices, would ensure that Constantinople's fall entered history as tragedy rather than farce. The city was dying. Its defenders would make that death count. Mehmed called his war council on May 26th and announced the final assault for May 29th at 1:30 in the morning. His generals expected the decision. Supplies couldn't sustain 80,000 men indefinitely, and summer heat would bring disease to crowded camps. The timing raised eyebrows. Most sieges attacked at dawn when defenders were groggy and visibility favoured assault. Mehmed explained his logic with terrifying clarity. Night attacks created confusion that favoured attackers, and launching before moonset would provide enough darkness for initial waves, while leaving hours of daylight for exploitation once breaches opened. The Sultan outlined tactics refined through 7 weeks of probing assaults. 3 waves would strike sequentially, each designed to exhaust defenders before the next arrived. Bashi bazooks would attack first, irregular troops, poorly armed volunteers, Christian vassals whose deaths cost the empire nothing. They'd carry ladders, grappling hooks, and fanatical courage fueled by promises of plunder. Their job wasn't to take walls, but to deplete Byzantine arrows, bolts, stones, and stamina. After 2 hours of Bashi bazook assault, regular Anatolian infantry would attack. These were professional soldiers with proper armour and weapons. They'd strike where preliminary waves had identified weaknesses, would press attacks systematically, would trade casualties for incremental advances. Defenders exhausted from fighting Bashi bazooks would face fresh troops attacking with discipline rather than frenzy. Finally, if needed, the Janissaries would deliver the killing blow. These elite slave soldiers represented the empire's finest infantry. Taken as boys from Christian families, converted to Islam, trained exclusively for war, they knew nothing but military service. They wore distinctive white felt caps, carried the best weapons Ottoman arsenals could produce, and had never failed to break a defence they were ordered to take. Mehmed would hold them in reserve, committing them only when and where decisive breakthrough seemed possible. Artillery would bombard through the night and continue during assaults, targeting towers and defensive positions rather than walls. Archers would provide covering fire. Ships in the Golden Horn would demonstrate against sea walls, forcing defenders to spread forces thinly. Simultaneously, attacks would strike multiple points along the land walls, preventing Byzantine commanders from concentrating reserves effectively. Ottoman officers dispersed to brief their units. Soldiers cleaned weapons, sharpened blades, checked armour straps. Imams moved through camps offering prayers and reminding men that death in holy war guaranteed paradise. The atmosphere combined religious fervour with professional preparation. These soldiers believed God favoured their cause while understanding that victory required more than faith. Byzantine scouts reported unusual activity in Ottoman camps on May 27th. The enemy was preparing something major, though exactly what remained unclear. Giustiniani ordered all troops to battle stations and kept them there for 36 hours. Better exhausted defenders than unprepared ones. Constantine walked the walls constantly, speaking to men in each section, ensuring everyone understood that the final test was imminent. May 28th arrived with oppressive humidity that made armour unbearable and turned every breath into labour. No wind stirred. Storm clouds built on the horizon but never approached. The air tasted metallic, charged with electricity that made hair stand on end and skin prickle. Soldiers on both sides felt it. The weather itself was holding its breath. Mehmed ordered a day of rest and prayer. No assaults, no artillery fire. Complete silence along the siege lines. The sudden absence of bombardment unnerved defenders more than continuous shelling had. They'd grown accustomed to constant noise. Quiet suggested something worse was coming. Ottoman camps erupted in celebrations that looked like victory parties. Musicians played, soldiers danced, bonfires blazed. The message was clear. The Ottomans were celebrating in advance because the outcome was inevitable. Constantinople responded with its own religious observances. Processions wound through every district. Priests led prayers in dozens of churches. The Hagia Sophia filled beyond capacity with citizens seeking divine intervention. Icons were paraded, relics displayed, hymns sung with desperate intensity. People who hadn't attended services in years pressed into churches, suddenly confronting their mortality and finding that nothing remained except faith. Constantine attended evening services at the Hagia Sophia, kneeling among common citizens rather than in the imperial section. He prayed for hours while his commanders watched uncomfortably. When he finally rose, his face showed acceptance rather than fear. He'd made peace with whatever was coming. The emperor toured the walls one final time after midnight, visiting every major defensive position, thanking men for their service, releasing anyone who wished to flee. No one left. Giustiniani made final inspections with military precision. Ammunition stockpiles checked. Defensive positions reinforced. Reserves positioned for rapid deployment. The Genoese commander had done everything possible to prepare for an assault whose timing and location remained uncertain. His 700 personal troops held the Lycus Valley sector, the weakest point, where walls showed the most damage, where breakthrough seemed most likely. If the line held anywhere, it would hold there under Giustiniani's command. At 1:30 in the morning on May 29th, Ottoman drums began beating. The sound rolled across the darkness like thunder, rhythmic and relentless. Then trumpets added their voices. Cymbals crashed. The noise built to levels that physically hurt, a wall of sound designed to shatter nerves before the first soldier attacked. Behind the music came shouting, 80,000 voices roaring in unison, calling on God and Sultan, working themselves into frenzy. The Bashi bazooks charged. They came as a human avalanche, thousands of men running toward walls that had stopped 23 previous sieges. Moonlight revealed their numbers, too many to count, too many to stop with conventional defense. They carried crude ladders, rope with grappling hooks, nothing sophisticated. Their weapons ranged from proper swords to farming implements. Many wore no armor. They were expendable, and they knew it, and they charged anyway because glory and plunder awaited survivors. Byzantine defenders unleashed everything simultaneously. Arrows darkened the sky. Crossbow bolts punched through bodies with mechanical efficiency. Stones rained from battlements, each crushing skulls or breaking bones. Boiling oil splashed onto climbing men, cooking them in their skin. Greek fire operators pumped streams of liquid flame that transformed attackers into running torches, whose screams could be heard above the drums. The Bashi bazooks died in hundreds, then thousands. Bodies piled at the wall's base, creating ramps of corpses that subsequent waves climbed. Ladders rose only to be pushed away by defenders using long poles. Grappling hooks caught on battlements, and men swarmed up ropes only to be cut down at the top. The assault was slaughter. The assault continued. For 2 hours, the irregular troops threw themselves at impenetrable defences. They achieved nothing except depleting Byzantine ammunition and exhausting men who'd been killing continuously since before dawn. Arrows ran low, crossbow strings broke from overuse, arms grew leaden from lifting stones. Greek fire reserves diminished to dangerous levels. The Bashi bazooks were dying by the thousands, but they were accomplishing their mission, bleeding defenders dry through sheer attrition. At 3:30, trumpets sounded recall. The surviving irregulars retreated, leaving perhaps 15,000 dead scattered before the walls. Defenders allowed themselves momentary relief. They'd held. The walls stood. Then fresh drums announced the second wave. Anatolian infantry advanced with professional discipline. These soldiers came in organised formations, shields overlapping, ladders carried by designated teams. They didn't charge mindlessly but approached under covering fire from Ottoman archers. Siege towers rolled forward, wooden structures taller than the walls, their tops protected by wet hides against Greek fire. Engineers had built them in sections during the siege, assembling them during the quiet of May 28th, while defenders watched helplessly. The towers reached the walls at multiple points. Drawbridges dropped, creating direct access from tower tops to battlements. Ottoman soldiers poured across while defenders fought desperately to hold narrow spaces. Hand-to-hand combat erupted along the walls. Swords, axes, daggers, fists. Men grappled and fell, dropping 60 feet to break on stones below. The fighting was intimate and horrific, close enough to smell opponents' breath, to see fear and determination in their eyes. Giustiniani seemed to be everywhere, rallying defenders, plugging gaps, leading counterattacks that threw Ottomans off the walls. His armour showed dozens of dents and scratches. Blood covered him. His own, enemies, impossible to distinguish. The man fought like someone who'd accepted death and was negotiating its terms, making the enemy pay for every second he remained alive. Constantine abandoned the imperial sections and joined the fighting at the Lycus Valley. His presence inspired defenders who'd thought their emperor would shelter in palaces while they died. He swung a sword with competence born from decades of training and warfare. Ottoman soldiers who recognized the purple-trimmed armor targeted him specifically, understanding that killing the emperor would break Byzantine resistance. His bodyguards died protecting him. He kept fighting. The Anatolian assault continued through pre-dawn darkness. Siege towers provided continuous reinforcement, feeding fresh troops onto walls where defenders struggled with exhaustion. But Byzantine forces held through skill and desperation. Every yard of a wall was contested. Every tower access point became a killing ground. The Anatolians were professionals, but they faced men defending their final refuge with nothing left to lose. As false dawn lightened the eastern sky around 5 o'clock, a cannonball struck near Giustiniani. The impact threw him against stone, and his breastplate cracked. Metal fragments drove into his chest. He collapsed, bleeding from wounds that would prove mortal but not immediately fatal. His men carried him away while he protested, trying to remain at his post even as blood soaked his armour from the inside. The effect was catastrophic. Giustiniani had been the defence's spine, the professional who kept amateurs organised and fighting effectively. His removal left command structure confused at the worst possible moment. Subordinate officers tried to fill the gap, but they lacked his presence, his tactical genius, his ability to be physically present wherever crisis emerged. The Lycus Valley defence wavered. Simultaneously, 50 Ottoman soldiers discovered that the Kirkaporta Gate, a small postern used for sorties, had been left unlocked. Some Byzantine unit had slipped out for a night raid and failed to secure the gate properly when returning. The Ottomans pushed through unopened resistance, climbed to a tower top, and raised their banner. A green flag with gold crescent appeared above walls that had never been breached. Byzantine defenders saw the banner and understood its meaning. The walls were penetrated. The unbreakable defence was broken. Panic spread faster than orders could stop it. Men who'd fought heroically for hours suddenly fled, convinced that further resistance was suicide. The retreat became rout. Soldiers abandoned positions, throwing down weapons to run faster. Mehmed had been watching from his command position, waiting for exactly this moment. He committed the Janissaries. 8,000 elite soldiers advanced in perfect formation, their white caps visible even in the growing dawn. They moved through breaches widened by earlier waves, climbed over dead from previous assaults, and hit the wavering Byzantine defence with irresistible force. These were the best soldiers in the world executing the task they'd trained for since childhood. Constantinople's fate was sealed. Constantine saw the Ottoman banner flying above the Kirkaporta Tower and understood that 11 centuries of Byzantine history were ending. The green flag with its golden crescent snapped in the morning breeze like a declaration from fate itself. Defenders who'd held through the night broke formation and ran. Officers screamed orders that no one heard over panic's roar. The systematic defence Justiniani had orchestrated dissolved into chaos within minutes. The emperor pulled off his purple imperial cloak and tossed it aside. The colour marked him as valuable, a target for capture rather than killing, a hostage for negotiation, a trophy for Mehmed's triumph. Constantine refused that fate. He would die as a soldier, anonymous among thousands of dead, rather than kneel before a conqueror. His closest companions, John Dalmata and Theophilus Palaiologus, stayed beside him as the retreat turned into catastrophe around them. Janissaries poured through multiple breaches now. The Kirkaporta gate had been widened by axes and crowbars, transforming a minor postern into a major access point. The Lycus Valley walls, weakened by 2 months of artillery, crumbled under coordinated assault. Ottoman soldiers climbed rubble slopes into the city proper, meeting sporadic resistance from defenders who'd lost all coordination. Small groups formed isolated pockets, fighting with the desperate efficiency of men who knew they were already dead. Constantine moved toward the thickest fighting near the St. Romanus Gate. Enemy soldiers flowed through the breach like water through a broken dam. Byzantine defenders tried to establish a secondary line but lacked the numbers to hold even temporarily. The emperor joined them anyway, sword in hand, fighting alongside men who recognized their sovereign only when close enough to see his face. No contemporary account reliably records Constantine's final words. Some claim he shouted that anyone willing to take his head should come forward. Others insist he cried that the city was falling and he would fall with it. Most witnesses were too busy fighting or fleeing to remember speeches. What everyone agrees on is that Constantine charged directly into the Ottoman advance, seeking death rather than capture. He disappeared into the mass of struggling men. Swords clashed, shields splintered, bodies fell in tangles that made footing treacherous. Constantine fought like any soldier, desperate strokes, defensive parries, nothing heroic or cinematic. He killed perhaps 2 men before overwhelming numbers bore him down. An axe struck his shoulder. A sword penetrated his side. He fell among dozens of others dying in that same minute, that same place. The last Roman emperor died in anonymous violence, probably unrecognized by the men who killed him. His body was never definitively identified. Ottoman soldiers looted corpses without examining faces. By the time anyone thought to search for the emperor, thousands of dead wore similar armor and displayed similar wounds. Some claim they found him by the purple boots only emperors wore, but those could have been stolen, traded, or simply mistaken. The mystery of Constantine's fate became Byzantine history's final enigma, appropriate for an empire that ended in confusion rather than clear conclusion. The Janissaries swept through the city's northern districts while dawn fully broke. Citizens who'd hoped walls would hold woke to sounds of combat in their streets. They ran, carrying children and whatever valuables could be grabbed in seconds. Most fled toward the Hagia Sophia, believing ancient prophecy that angels would descend when enemies reached the great church. Thousands crowded inside, jamming the building beyond capacity. They locked the doors. They prayed. They waited for miracles that never came. Ottoman forces spread through Constantinople like floodwater, following streets and alleys, breaking into houses, securing each district systematically. Resistance continued in scattered pockets. Some Byzantine nobles barricaded themselves in fortified mansions with their personal guards, turning urban homes into tiny fortresses. These holdouts fell within hours as Ottoman soldiers brought up axes and battering rams. Anyone who fought after the walls fell was killed immediately. Those who surrendered faced slavery but survived. Genoese and Venetian merchants barricaded their quarters and flew neutral flags from rooftops. Ottoman soldiers initially respected these markers, understanding that Mehmed wanted profitable relationships with Italian city-states. But discipline broke down as soldiers tasted victory. Some units ignored the flags and broke into merchant warehouses anyway, claiming confusion or asserting that neutrality meant nothing once the city fell. Venetian ships in the harbour cut their anchors and fled before Ottoman forces reached the docks. The defence at the sea walls collapsed simultaneously with land fortifications. Defenders who'd held positions overlooking the Golden Horn saw Ottoman banners rising throughout the city and abandoned their posts. Naval combat became irrelevant once enemy soldiers controlled both ends of every defensive position. Byzantine ships in the harbour were captured or burned. Crews who surrendered were chained together for the slave markets. Those who resisted died on their decks. By 8 in the morning, organised resistance had ceased. Individual soldiers still fought, small groups still held buildings, scattered nobles still refused surrender. But these were death throes, not defence. The Byzantine Empire was finished. What remained was documentation: who lived, who died, who escaped, who was enslaved. Mehmed entered Constantinople around noon, riding a white stallion through the St. Romanus Gate where his janissaries had broken through. He wore simple campaign armour rather than ceremonial regalia, appearing as the warrior who'd conquered rather than the sultan accepting tribute. His face showed satisfaction, but not joy. He'd achieved the goal that obsessed him for 3 years, but the cost had been severe. Casualty estimates suggested 50,000 Ottoman dead, though accurate counts were impossible. He'd paid in blood for every yard of stone. The Sultan rode directly to the Hagia Sophia. The great church rose above Constantinople's skyline, its massive dome visible from every part of the city. Mehmed had studied descriptions of the building since childhood, had read accounts of its construction under Justinian, understood its symbolic importance as the heart of Orthodox Christianity. Taking Constantinople meant nothing if he couldn't possess the Hagia Sophia. Ottoman soldiers had surrounded the church but not yet breached it. Thousands of citizens remained barricaded inside, still believing prophecy would save them. The doors were massive bronze barriers reinforced with iron, designed to resist anything short of siege equipment. Mehmed ordered them broken immediately. Soldiers brought axes and hammers. The doors held for 20 minutes before hinges failed. Ottoman troops poured into the church. The scene inside testified to desperate hope betrayed. Families huddled around altars. Priests stood before icons with crosses raised. Children cried. The elderly prayed. Everyone expected either salvation or slaughter. They received neither. Mehmed had ordered that the building itself not be damaged. It was too beautiful, too historically significant, too useful as the centerpiece of his new capital. Soldiers were instructed to remove the people without destroying the structure. The removal was brutal but not genocidal. Able-bodied men were separated for slavery. Women and children followed. The elderly and sick were sometimes killed, sometimes abandoned, depending on individual soldiers' inclinations. Valuable clothing was stripped. Jewellery was confiscated. Within 2 hours the Hagia Sophia stood empty, except for corpses of those who'd resisted or died from stress and exhaustion. Mehmed dismounted and entered the church personally. He walked slowly down the nave, examining mosaics, studying architectural features, absorbing the space that represented centuries of Christian devotion. A soldier was breaking floor tiles to collect valuables buried beneath. The Sultan stopped him and declared that enough damage had been done. This building would become a mosque, the centerpiece of Ottoman Constantinople, and it would be preserved rather than looted. He climbed to the dome's base where an imam waited. The call to prayer echoed through spaces that had heard Christian liturgy for 900 years. Mehmed prayed facing Mecca, officially converting the Hagia Sophia to Islamic use. The symbolism was calculated and complete. Not just conquest, but transformation. Not just defeat, but replacement. The building's function had changed as absolutely as the empire's existence had ended. Meanwhile, Islamic law granted soldiers 3 days of plunder following a city's capture. The provision existed to motivate troops, to provide tangible reward beyond salary, to allow warriors to share in victory's profits. Mehmed could not revoke this right without risking mutiny. He could only channel it, directing soldiers towards specific districts while protecting others, trying to preserve infrastructure his new capital would need. What followed tested every description of horror. Ottoman soldiers spread through residential districts with license to take whatever they wanted. Houses were ransacked. Hidden wealth was extracted through torture. Women were claimed as war prizes regardless of age or wishes. Children were separated from parents and distributed as slaves. The old were killed when they couldn't keep pace with forced marches to collection points. Streets ran with blood from casual violence that accompanied systematic looting. Libraries burned. Manuscripts accumulated over centuries went up in flames as soldiers used books for campfire fuel or destroyed them seeking valuables hidden in bindings. The knowledge contained in those texts, Greek philosophy, Roman history, Byzantine theology, scientific treatises that existed nowhere else, vanished in smoke. Some scholars later claimed the loss set human knowledge back generations. Certainly libraries throughout Europe benefited from refugees who fled carrying whatever books they could save. The Grand Duke Lucas Notaras, Constantinople's wealthiest noble, survived the initial conquest by hiding in his fortified mansion. Mehmed summoned him on the second day, seeking cooperation from Byzantine aristocracy to help govern the conquered city. Notaras arrived with his family, hoping to negotiate position and protection. The Sultan demanded the Grand Duke's sons for his personal service, a euphemism for sexual slavery that everyone understood. Notaras refused. His sons were Christian nobles, not commodities for Ottoman pleasure. Mehmed had both sons beheaded in front of their father, then executed Notaras himself. The message was explicit. Cooperation had limits, but defiance had none. Other Byzantine nobles witnessed the execution and became remarkably agreeable afterward, offering their resources, their knowledge, their loyalty to the new regime. Yet Mehmed also showed calculated mercy. He appointed a new Orthodox patriarch within days, guaranteeing religious freedom for Greek Christians who submitted to Ottoman authority. The gesture was strategic. He needed local administration, needed the population pacified, needed trade restored quickly. Massacring everyone would leave him ruling ruins. Selective tolerance would create a functioning capital faster than pure destruction. The 3 days of plunder officially ended on June 1st. Soldiers were ordered to cease looting and return to military discipline. Many complied. Some continued operating in small groups, hiding stolen goods and captured slaves until they could be smuggled out of the city. Mehmed executed several men for violating the order, but enforcement was selective. He'd gotten what he wanted: a conquered city, a functioning capital, and an army satisfied with victory's rewards. Constantinople fell silent on June 2nd in ways it never had before. No church bells rang. They'd been melted or stolen. No merchants called their wares. The markets were empty. No children played in streets that remained stained with blood. The city that had survived 23 sieges, that had been continuously inhabited for over 1,000 years, that had served as Rome's successor and Christianity's eastern shield, was fundamentally dead. A new city would rise in the same location with the same buildings, but it would be Ottoman, Islamic, Turkish. Byzantium had ended. The 3 days of sanctioned plunder transformed Constantinople from living city to hollowed monument. Ottoman soldiers moved through districts with systematic efficiency that turned chaos into process. Each house was marked after being searched. Chalk symbols on doors indicated whether the building had been cleared, whether resistance had been encountered, whether valuables remained. The system prevented redundant looting while ensuring nothing escaped Ottoman hands. Slave markets appeared spontaneously in major squares. Captured citizens were chained together and displayed like livestock. Buyers examined teeth, felt muscles, assessed age and health with practiced efficiency. Prices fluctuated based on skills. Educated Greeks who could read and write commanded premiums. Craftsmen with valuable trades sold for decent amounts. Common labourers went cheap. Children were separated by age and gender for different markets. The elderly were frequently abandoned or killed as worthless inventory that consumed food without generating profit. Approximately 50,000 Byzantine citizens entered slavery during those 3 days. The number represents educated guess rather than precise count, but multiple sources suggest half of Constantinople's surviving population was enslaved. Some ended up in Ottoman households as domestic servants. Others went to agricultural estates. Young boys were evaluated for potential janissary training. Girls and young women faced the slave harems that supplied Ottoman nobles with concubines. The very fortunate were ransomed by relatives wealthy enough to buy them back. Mehmed established his authority through calculated acts of mercy and violence. He ordered that craftsmen essential for running the city, bakers, blacksmiths, masons, shipwrights, be identified and protected from enslavement. Ottoman officials went through slave markets buying back skilled workers who had been needed for reconstruction. The Sultan understood that Constantinople's value lay in its function as a trading hub and administrative capital. Ruins generated no revenue. A working city generated perpetual income. He also executed soldiers who exceeded plunder rights in specific ways. Killing unarmed civilians during the 3-day period was legal under Islamic law governing conquest. But several janissaries had burned a library that Mehmed specifically wanted preserved. The Sultan had them impaled in the library's courtyard as warning to others. Selective enforcement sent clear messages. Take what you want within limits, but damage that affects my interests brings death. The Venetian merchant quarter received mixed treatment. Some buildings were respected when merchants produced documents proving their neutrality and value to Ottoman trade interests. Other Venetian properties were sacked when soldiers decided that neutrality meant nothing after walls fell. The Genoese and Galata negotiated better terms. Their cooperation during the siege, particularly regarding the chain and harbour access, earned them trading privileges that would last decades. Mehmed was pragmatic about former enemies who could become profitable subjects. Byzantine nobles who survived faced impossible choices: submit to Ottoman authority and face second-class status in their own city, or flee to uncertain futures in foreign lands. Most fled. Ships departing Constantinople in early June carried aristocrats who'd lost everything except their lives. They scattered to Venice, Genoa, Rome, anywhere that would accept refugees from the fallen empire. These exiles carried manuscripts, icons, memories of a civilization that no longer existed except in their stories. The scholarly exodus proved historically significant beyond anyone's contemporary understanding. Greek scholars fleeing Constantinople brought classical texts that had been preserved in Byzantine libraries but unknown to Western Europe. Manuscripts of Plato, Aristotle, Homer, Euclid arrived in Italian cities where Renaissance was beginning to flower. The fall of Constantinople inadvertently triggered intellectual revolution as ancient knowledge flowed westward with refugees who needed to sell their books for survival money. Cardinal Isidore of Kiev, who'd been in Constantinople trying to negotiate church union between Orthodox and Catholic Christianity, escaped by disguising himself as a beggar. He made his way to Rome and reported the city's fall to Pope Nicholas V. The Pope called for a crusade to recapture Constantinople. European monarchs expressed sympathy and did nothing. Venice and Genoa were already negotiating trade agreements with Mehmed. Hungarian forces were committed elsewhere. The crusade existed only in papal proclamations that nobody took seriously. Mehmed renamed Constantinople to Istanbul, though the change took decades to become universal. He declared it the Ottoman capital, shifting the empire's centre from Adrianople. The symbolism was intentional. By ruling from Rome's successor city, he claimed legitimacy as heir to classical civilization. Ottoman became the Third Rome, the final evolution of an imperial tradition stretching back to Augustus Caesar. The claim was audacious, historically questionable, and politically brilliant. Reconstruction began immediately. Mehmed ordered repairs to walls damaged during the siege. He commissioned new mosques to be built on sites of demolished churches. The Hagia Sophia's conversion required architectural modifications. Minarets were added. Christian imagery was plastered over or removed. The interior was reorganized to face Mecca. The building survived these changes because Mehmed valued its beauty more than ideological purity. He wanted Istanbul to be magnificent, not just Islamic. Population posed immediate problems. 50,000 enslaved, thousands killed, thousands more fled. The city that once held 500,000 now contained perhaps 30,000 free inhabitants. Mehmed ordered forced resettlement from across the empire. Turkish families from Anatolia, Greeks from other regions, Armenians, Jews expelled from Spain, all were relocated to Istanbul to revive its economy. The Sultan offered tax breaks and property rights to anyone willing to settle in the conquered capital. Within a decade, the population recovered to functional levels, though the demographic character had fundamentally changed. Trade routes shifted with Constantinople's fall. Venetian and Genoese merchants lost their privileged positions in Eastern Mediterranean commerce. Ottoman control of the Bosphorus meant all trade between Black Sea and Mediterranean passed through Istanbul, generating customs revenue that filled Mehmed's treasury. The Sultan charged access fees, regulated what could be transported, and manipulated prices to Ottoman advantage. The economic impact rippled through Europe as traditional trade patterns collapsed and new ones emerged. Portuguese expeditions already searching for alternative routes to Asian spices received new urgency after 1453. If land routes through Ottoman territory were costly and uncertain, perhaps ocean routes might bypass the problem entirely. The fall of Constantinople accelerated Portuguese exploration down Africa's coast, eventually leading to Vasco da Gama reaching India by sea and Columbus attempting to reach Asia by sailing west. Constantinople's conquest helped trigger the age of exploration by making old trade routes untenable. Military technology evolved rapidly after the siege. European powers recognized that medieval fortifications were obsolete against modern artillery. Castle and city wall designs changed throughout the 1450s and 1460s, becoming lower and thicker, incorporating angular bastions that deflected cannonballs rather than absorbing them. The star fort design that dominated European military architecture for centuries originated partly from lessons learned at Constantinople. Walls that had protected cities for millennia suddenly required complete reconceptualization. Gunpowder weapons that had been curiosities in 1450 became essential military equipment by 1460. European armies invested in artillery trains, hired gun founders, developed doctrines for combined arms tactics integrating cannon with infantry and cavalry. The siege of Constantinople demonstrated that technology could overcome numerical disadvantages, that engineering mattered as much as courage, that warfare was changing in fundamental ways. Commanders who ignored these lessons lost their next battles. Giovanni Giustiniani survived his wounds temporarily. Ottoman soldiers found him during the three-day plunder, recognized his quality armour, and held him for ransom. Genoese merchants negotiated his release, paying substantial sums for their famous mercenary captain. He was transported to Chios, a Genoese island, where physicians attempted to save him. The chest wounds proved fatal despite their efforts. He died on June 1st, surviving Constantinople's fall by 3 days, long enough to know his defence had failed but not long enough to endure the shame. Mehmed ordered a full accounting of Constantinople's wealth seized during the conquest. The inventory took weeks and revealed treasures that exceeded even optimistic estimates. Gold and silver measured in tons, jewels by the thousands, artworks, manuscripts, relics, trade goods, weapons, armour. The accumulated wealth of centuries filled Ottoman warehouses. The Sultan distributed portions to his soldiers as promised, kept substantial amounts for the imperial treasury, and sold the rest to fund reconstruction and future campaigns. The human cost defied precise calculation. Estimates suggest 4,000 Byzantine soldiers died defending the walls. Civilian casualties during the three-day plunder probably reached another 4,000, though numbers vary wildly depending on source. Ottoman losses exceeded 50,000 across the entire siege, making it one of the bloodiest campaigns of the medieval period. For 57 days, approximately 2,000 men per day died on average. The mathematics of violence were staggering even by contemporary standards accustomed to brutal warfare. European reaction mixed horror with relief. Catholics mourned Orthodoxy's defeat while secretly celebrating schismatic Byzantium's elimination. Venice and Genoa lost commercial advantages but gained in other areas as trade patterns shifted. Hungary faced increased Ottoman pressure on its borders. The Pope proclaimed crisis while doing nothing substantive. European powers demonstrated that they would let distant allies fall rather than commit resources to defence. The lesson wasn't lost on smaller states watching larger neighbours calculate whether helping was worthwhile. Constantinople's fall marked a historical inflection point that contemporaries recognised immediately. This wasn't just another city changing hands. It was the end of an empire that claimed direct continuity with Rome, that had preserved classical learning through dark ages, that had stood as Christianity's eastern bulwark for 8 centuries. Medieval chroniclers understood they were recording civilization-scale change. The Byzantine Empire that traced its lineage to Constantine the Great, that had survived barbarian invasions, Islamic conquests, crusader betrayals, and internal collapse, finally ceased to exist on May 29th, 1453. The Theodosian walls still stand today in modern Istanbul. Stone blocks show scars from Ottoman cannonballs, craters filled with later repairs, sections rebuilt by Turkish engineers. Tourists walk along battlements where Byzantine defenders died by thousands. The walls outlasted the empire they protected, becoming monuments to the obvious truth that no defence is permanent, that every wall eventually falls, that technology and determination can overcome any fortification given enough time and blood. Constantinople's conquest changed how Europeans thought about security, trade, and civilization's fragility. The city everyone believed was unconquerable had fallen. If those walls could fail, what was safe? The event generated existential anxiety that fueled religious reformation, military innovation, and geographic exploration. The medieval world ended when Constantinople fell, not because the calendar changed, but because fundamental assumptions about power and permanence proved false. The Renaissance and early modern period emerged partly from ruins of Byzantine civilization, built on knowledge that empires die, that strength is temporary, that nothing lasts forever except the memory of what was lost.